India and the EU have reached a major free trade agreement described by India PM Modi as a landmark deal. Now, last week, Trump backed away from planned tariffs on several European countries following talks tied to the future of Greenland. Trump saying a framework for a future deal was reached after discussions with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Now, following those talks, the tariff threats against the EU allies were dropped. And at the same time, Trump is warning of steep trade penalties elsewhere. He has threatened to impose tariffs on China and did announce that on South Korea overnight. Now, this week, a partial government shutdown is looming as the Senate prepares to vote on a major federal funding package. Well, joining me this morning to weigh in is Matt Gertken, BCA's chief strategist of geopolitical and U.S. political strategy. Matt, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. Well, first and foremost, after decades of NATO-backed stability, have recent events actually upended the assumptions that kept the post-war order intact?
Hi, Remy. Well, thanks for having me. Yes, I think that a lot of the assumptions were incorrect, particularly about economic integration around the world. What we saw was a period of enormous integration, but it wasn't enough to prevent great power politics from reemerging. Russia and China both reemerged. The U.S. experienced financial crisis, polarization. It was engaged in wars. The U.S. has status anxiety about its position in the world, and it's sort of vacillating about how to deal with that. And that's why we see the U.S. lurching from policy to policy, from administration to administration. And this has ruffled feathers of allies as well as rivals.
Yeah, and speaking of which, we are hearing about deals being made outside of the U.S. And of course, as we focus on the nation's capital here, a partial government shutdown looming over the nation's capital. And also, we're hearing from major business leaders in Minnesota, including 3M, Cargill, United Health, Target, all calling for de-escalation after a fatal shooting of a citizen involving federal agents over the weekend. So how much does this moment actually raise the stakes for lawmakers trying to fund the government and set limits on federal enforcement?
Well, the underlying issue, of course, is tragic what happened in Minnesota, and the administration is attempting to move forward on a very aggressive immigration reform, strengthening borders and then ultimately deporting people who have been in the country illegally. But that was always going to be a messy policy, just like tariffs. These are difficult policies to enact. So you want to get control of trade and immigration, you want to get tougher control of your borders, but then there's domestic interests and there's people who are affected, and this puts the administration in a tight spot. With the midterm election looming, Democrats want to show their constituents that they're not just going along with what the Trump administration does, that they're willing to stand up and fight, and so they have an incentive to do that. And then meanwhile, the Trump administration, well, they don't really have the votes to just drive things through entirely on their own, particularly in the Senate. And so what we end up with is it could very well be another government shutdown. But the key here is that both sides are trying to rally their voters ahead of the midterm election.
Yeah, and you mentioned tariffs. So the Supreme Court did not rule on Trump's tariffs on January 20th, and they pushed a decision likely to later next month. And a ruling against Trump could open the door for more than $130 billion in refunds and mark his biggest legal defeat since returning to the White House. But given everything that's happened so far, how do you see everything shaking out, and what outcome is most likely here?
Yeah, well, if we take it all together, the big decision would be the Supreme Court decision on tariffs, because that would limit all future presidents from behaving in a unilateral way, imposing sweeping tariffs. Uh, but I'm not as convinced as the consensus that the Supreme Court will entirely shoot down the president. I think it's about 50-50. But remember that the law that the president is acting on is a law for international emergencies. And the court is typically reluctant to limit the president on the international front. What we've seen is that Trump is so willing to break norms and act aggressively internationally that the court might need to introduce some distance there and imply that the president does face some limits in his use of these powers abroad. So it could be a nuanced decision. The president can then use other tariff authorities, but with the Federal Reserve ruling and with the tariff ruling, what we'll see is that the Supreme Court is an active agent, that there is a balance of power, and there are still checks and balances in the U.S. system. and that President Trump won't be able to get away with everything that everything that he wants to.
Yeah, and Matt, finally, before I let you go, let's take a look at our neighbor up north. So Canada is saying it is not pursuing a free trade deal with China, and Carney is pointing to Canada's USMCA obligations, which require notifying partners before any deal with a non-market economy. So given that context, what's behind the new tariff threat here?
Well, I think the new tariff threat stemmed out of the Davos meetings and the speech that Mark Carney gave, which sort of implied that Canada would be free to pursue engagements with all countries around the world other than the US if the US doesn't want to be cooperative. But that was right after having agreed to a strategic partnership with China, and so it was antagonistic to the United States. Ultimately, President Trump, with this midterm looming, doesn't have a huge incentive to implement large scale tariffs, particularly on Canada and Mexico, because that's where a third of U.S. Imports come from. But what he can do is immediately after the midterm, he can ratchet up the trade war very significantly. And also, if the U.S. economy continues to be resilient, then he may have some leeway even during the midterm election year. But probably he needs to hold off on the big guns until afterwards. And that means we'll see a lot of negotiations this year and a lot of threats. But the big action probably won't come from Trump. It'll probably come from other players in the world who aren't facing elections and who may have enough economic or political support that they can take some risks. And that's not President Trump this year.
Yeah, and Matt, we have less than 60 seconds here. So how do you see things transpiring when it comes to Greenland?
I think the U.S. will continue under Trump to pursue a purchase of Greenland, but I've been saying emphatically that the U.S. would not seize the territory. That would indeed shatter the faith in NATO, and it would ensure that Europe would have to provide for its own defense, in which case the U.S. and Europe would become increasingly alienated geopolitical entities, and over time they would be ones with separate military forces. That would be a loss both to U.S. interests and U.S. armed forces, as well as to European security. And so it's not a good deal. It probably won't happen. And it means that there'll be talk of a Greenland purchase. President Trump needs congressional approval ultimately for that, and I don't think he'll get it. So it could be a long time if the U.S. ever is going to acquire Greenland.
Well, Matt, we will have to leave it there. But as always, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your perspective.